Folks, I'm glad we're able to come together even on this rainy night. We might hear a little Westminster chime every once in a while from the doorbell ringer over there. So somebody can kindly open the door for the people who are latecomers. So hello, it's great to be learning with you. Great to be learning with you tonight. And I'm going to speak a little louder. Okay. What I'd like to do with us this evening, Rabbanit and Atara and I, who had met a few months ago and started talking about the idea of having, from time to time, a seminar together that we would co-lead, which I think is a super opportunity for us both. So we decided this would be our first session, and it's about really appreciating how it is that we got to the shul configuration that we have and the Mechitza that we have, and to understand how, firstly, what Mechitza premises are and the premises of our Mechitza. And that's really what I wanted to spend our time with, and the values that it might reflect and what we're trying to achieve with it. And so I hope that as we do this learning together, we'll get there. The format we'll have is, these few words of introduction. Rabbi Atara is going to do some teaching about the Beit HaMikdash, the temple. I'll do some talking about how that transfers over to synagogue structures and setups, and then a little reflection on experiences, and then a little bit more directly about our shul. That's kind of how I want to, we kind of frame the evening. So let's just point out that if you look in halachic literature, you don't find that much direct discussion about how to set up a mechitza in a shul. And that's either because it was kind of a given, or for the most part, they didn't have mechitzas in shuls because very often in a lot of communities, the women didn't come to shul at all. Or if they did, there was often simply there was the Beit Knesset, and then there was an adjunct space on the side, perhaps with a wall and a window that you could look in, you can peer in. And so there wasn't that much discussion. By the way, we should put our phones on mute, but that's going to be a problem for me. Okay. And so that was not very often discussed. They kind of knew what they were going to do in the communities where women were coming. And as you might be aware, some of the grand Orthodox synagogues in Europe were often not mechitza spaces. They were balconied spaces, right? Where there was also a configuration and a setup which we'll see might have its antecedents in very early teachings. So there isn't much discussion about it. It's not really until more modern times when things were changing in very different ways. In the Reform movement, they were changing, and there was sort of a response to what was happening there, whether in Europe or in this country. Rabbi Ismail Wise was the first introduced family seating in Albany in the early 1850s, and the Reform movement, and that was sort of set a trend that eventually back and forth where that happened. And then in the conservative movement, as we are aware of. And so what you'll find is that a lot of the halachic discussion comes in response to those realities, where we're either the external challenges that are happening and we're trying to hold our folks in and not going that route, or even without those external challenges, the sense that some communities were modernizing and seeking to change what the structures were, and so there was a response to if supportive or not. So that's his background, and I encourage you to go. You can read Professor Sarna's article about the experience in the United States. That's what's worthy of your time, and you can do other research about what synagogues were like in the past many centuries. So we're going to talk about how that rabbinic literature seems to develop and what it pointed to, and I will note that there were a series of cases, especially in this country in the 1950s, right, the mid 1950s, late 1950s, where some synagogues were looking to make a change, often to remove their mechitzas. There was a battle against the modernizing forces, and we just know the history that Orthodox and the Orthodox and conservative movements through the seminary and Yeshiva University were sort of fighting for congregations all over the place, trying to hold on to or deal with this newly established congregations. And in one or two cases, situations, there were court cases brought about attempts to remove mechitzot and to go to mixed pews in some way or another. A number of times the courts say we're staying out of this. This is not our business. And in one case, the courts got involved, and based on the contract and the premises of the congregation, and the founding documents, what isn't considered to be Orthodox seating, if you call yourself an Orthodox synagogue. And there is a book, and I went looking for it. I think it's probably still in one of our boxes over at the Bessler storage area that we have, called The Sanctity of the Synagogue, which is a collection of all the material that was brought in that case. And it was the Mount Clemens, Michigan case, which is rich with some of the great names of the 20th century and their strong advocacy for retaining Mechitza situation. So we'll draw a little bit on some of those teachings as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Rabbi Atara. We'll do some learning, and then we'll do some reflecting together.
Okay. Is that good? Should I stand? We can adjust. Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay. So just we're taking you back now out of the world of shuls in the modern in kind of the modern shul or synagogue that we're used to, but to the temples, the Beit HaMikdash, where that is the earliest time that we have an example of men and women being separated in a religious space. I'm going to orient you a little bit, the first Mishnah, to what those spaces were, what they looked like. But just in the back of your mind, even though this is the source for Mechitza and separate seating in our shuls today, what was going on in the temple was not what our synagogues look like today. There weren't services 3 times a day with prayer. There were prayers that might have been said, but it was centered on sacrifices and other religious events that we'll talk about a little bit today. And that's where we're going to see how the separate seating came about, or separate standing, as we might see also. So if you look in your first page, there's a diagram. This is kind of a floor plan of the temple. And on the left-hand side, which is actually, I think it should be flipped, because I think that was the eastern side, was something called that's the Ezrat Nashim. And we're going to talk about that space. I just want to show you where that is. Ezrat Nashim is the women's gallery, but that's what it was called. But we're going to, it's not the Ezrat Nashim that we're talking about today. I'm going to explain. I'm just keep that in your mind. So the first Mishnah is a Mishnah in Masechet Kelim, and it goes through the different levels of Kedusha, of holiness, which doesn't mean that one was better than the next. It just meant that, I guess there were different ways that you had to be pure, different levels of purity, or different things that you had to do in order to access a certain space. And the most intense spaces, let's say, the most internal spaces, were for the priests, and some were even only for the priest on the Kohen on Yom Kippur. So the first thing the Mishnah says is that first we're going to talk about the areas within the walls of Jerusalem, right? For those of us who have been in Jerusalem, it's a walled city, right? The old city of Jerusalem. And once you get into the walled cities, that's already holier than outside of the city. And then it says, then we go even further, and we have the Temple Mount. We're not even on the Beit HaMikdash yet. We have Har HaBayit, and that has a different level of holiness than the rest of the city. And then we have what's called the Chel, which is the rampart, which is this boundary around the Beit HaMikdash, and that has a level of holiness that's holier than the actual Har HaBayit, than Temple Mount. And then the next level is the Ezrat Nashim, which is kind of where you would enter first, right? That was the gallery that anyone would come into who had achieved that level of holiness, of that purity is probably a better word. And then there were 15 steps. If you look at this circular way, there are 15 steps that went up to this Ezrat Yisrael, which is where you could go, which is where was other, if you weren't a Kohen, you could still go there for certain things. And then there was the Ezrat Kohanim, and so forth. And something that I read is actually that the Ezrat Nashim was one of the only places that was a place where you could still sit. Within the Ezrat Yisrael, you weren't allowed to have a seat because that was considered disrespectful to the Beit HaMikdash. But the Ezrat Nashim, they allowed you to sit down if you were tired. So if people were there for a long time, you might want to be in the Ezrat Nashim. Now, we're calling it the Ezrat Nashim. Nashim is women. It's the gallery of women. But it was not what we want to say is that the Ezrat Nashim wasn't only for women at first. There were men and women there for most of the right, because it was just kind of a level of sanctity or purity, and also there were women who were at times in the Ezrat Yisrael. Okay, so meaning it was called that, and there are reasons for why it might have been more women there. I heard something by Rav Schechter, that actually they thought that maybe there were more women who had strollers who might have wanted to sit with their babies. So that's maybe why it was named the Ezrat Nashim, but it was for anybody who had achieved that level of purity. But there's a Tosfot, your second source on the bottom beneath the diagram, where there's in the Gemara in Kedushin is saying, was there ever a woman in the Ezrat Yisrael? And like, they want to know, were there ever women there? And Rashi says that women were never there, but Tosfot says that's impossible. Tosfot's a commentary on the Talmud. And he says that Rashi for sure is not telling the truth. He says because that we never see that women are forbidden to enter the courtyard. That's never a rule that we have. So, and he has examples as such. We know that a Nazir, someone who was a Nazirite, could have been a man or a woman. That's very clear in the Torah, that there could have been a man or a woman who had to do that. And a Nazir had to go into the Ezrat Yisrael. And also a Sota also had to go in. So he said that for sure, women were allowed to go there. So it might have been rare. It might not have been what you usually saw there because priests were only men, and there might have been men doing more things there, but it was for sure it was definitely heard of that women would go there, and there were men in the other place as well. But then, as we're going to see, there was a time where they decided that there needed to be a separation of men and women, even in the Ezrat Nashim, at certain times of the year. So the first Mishnah I want to call your attention to, which is right, Mishnah is earlier in the Talmud, is a Mishnah from Masechet Midot, where it says that the Mishnah is going to point to the fact that the Ezrat Nashim, this women's gallery, went through a structural change. And it says the Ezrat Nashim, v'chalka hayta b'rishona. So originally it had smooth walls all around, I guess kind of like our walls here. And then something happened, v'hikifuha kitzotzra, and they surrounded it with balconied enclosures, it says in the English. And it said that the woman would be upstairs, and the men would be down, kind of down. And the Mishnah gives a reason, kedei shelo yehu ma'orvin, so they would not be intermixed. Okay, so we're seeing that there was some sort of change in construction. So we want to know why. How did this come about? Why was this change made? So then we're going to bring you to I guess we're in the second source in the third section. Is a Gemara from Mishnah from the Sechet Sukkah. We're going to start with the Mishnah. The Mishnah is talking about something that happened on the second night of Sukkot, right? So we have the first night of Sukkot. The first night of Sukkot is Sukkot, it's Yom Tov, and then we say Havdalah, right? And then we have Chol HaMoed. And at times of the temple, on Motzei Yom Tov, they would have this huge thing called the Simchat Beit HaShoeva. And the Mishnah talks about how there were torches, there was juggling. It was a very exciting night. I think there might have been fireworks, and people still have this tradition today. And the Mishnah tells us, Misha lo ra'ah Simchat Beit HaShoeva, lo ra'ah Simcha miyamav. If you never experienced this party, the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, which happens in the Beit HaMikdash, you've never seen real happiness in your life. Okay, and they would, where would this party happen? Where would this Simchat Beit HaShoeva happen? It happened in the women's gallery, in the Ezrat Nashim. Now realize there's men and women here. And then the Mishnah tells us, Umitaknin sham tikun gadol, and they made this big renovation, or this big repair, I guess is a better word. And we want to know, what is this repair? What did they do? So look at the Gemara then starts. So the Gemara is talking about this Mishnah. And he says, Mati kun gadol. What is this big? What was this? And then they're quoting a Breita. So again, we're still quoting an earlier source. Let's have right Amar Rabbi Elazar, and he starts explaining, kind of quoting the Mishnah in Midot, which we saw before. And he uses this word, a great word, gezutstra. The hikifua gezutstra, right? And that's a gallery, kind of how we might see the women's gallery today in some synagogues. And they're saying, so women would sit above and the men would be below. And this is during the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, during this party. And then they bring another Breita, another like source that's from the same time period as the Mishnah, to explain how this came about. And they say, actually, right, it wasn't so simple how they were going to do this. They say, Birishona, at the beginning, they knew they wanted to have a separation of men and women. They tried different strategies. First, they had the women inside and the men outside, and still brought some sort of levity, right? So and this was levity that was inappropriate for the Simchat Beit HaShoeva. Even though this was a fun party, it still was happening in the Beit HaMikdash. It's not just a party that we're having in a bar, right? This is a party that's happening within the context of something spiritual, of something holy, and it was an inappropriate environment, even with the women inside and the men outside. So then they said, okay, let's try something else. And they had the women sit inside And the women sit outside and the men inside, and it still didn't achieve the goal they wanted to achieve. And then they said, okay, we're going to have to do some construction, and we're going to have women sit upstairs and the men sit downstairs. And then the Gemara says, wait a second, that's not so possible. Heichi avir hachi. How do they do this? You can't just decide to renovate the Beit HaMikdash, right? What if I just say, like, I want to move the menorah over here? You can't just do that. It was, right, the plans for the Beit HaMikdash are from the Torah, and we can't just make changes as we want. And so the Gemara finds a source for it from Zechariah, and there's a source in Zechariah that talks about a funeral. The funeral, according to the Bavli, was for Mashiach. What's going to be it's like not for now. It's a vision for what's going to happen in the future. According to the Jerusalem Talmud, the Yerushalmi, this might also been a funeral for the Yetzer Hara. The evil inclination we were going to have a funeral for then. And there, the Zechariah talks about how men and women sat separately at this funeral. And so the Gemara says, if when the Yetzer Hara is not alive, whether it's a funeral for Mashiach or our evil inclination is not alive, or maybe we're every morning the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination in itself, and there we have that men and women are sitting separately. How much more so in a party of levity where we want a certain environment, men and women should sit separately as well. So that's their source for why it was okay to do a renovation, to have a situation where we could have a party where we have an appropriate level of behavior between men and women. So that's how it came about. And again, they tried different configurations, right? Like we said, and they decided that the best configuration for the Simchat Beit HaShoeva was going to be with women are sitting in balconies on top, and the women are sitting in balconies on top, and the women are on the bottom. If you turn to the next page, on page number 3, we have the Rambam. Rambam is Maimonides, and Maimonides has 2 different types of books, commentaries on let's say that where he talks about this separate seating arrangement. The first one that we're going to see is a commentary on the Mishnah. So the commentary on the Mishnah in Sukkah is the first one where he talks about this big repair. And Maimonides also offered explanations as to why this repair was necessary. So the Gemara we said was because we didn't want to have this kalut rosh, which is levity, but what exactly what were we trying to accomplish also? It wasn't just to prevent something. So if you look at the first source from Maimonides, from Rambam, what he says is that the reason why they had the woman up high and the men down below was so that the men would not gaze or look at the woman. Kadesh lo yistaklu ha'anashim binashim. So there we have the Maimonides explaining that this is about something visual. But then the Rambam also has another book, which is a book of practical halacha called the Mishnah Torah, where in 2 places we're going to see that he gives a slightly different explanation as to why the women and men were sitting separately. So the first one is from the halachot, the laws of shofar, sukkah, and lulav, where he says that on Erev Yom Tov, the day before Yom Tov, they would go and they would do this renovation in the Beit HaMikdash, and they would have the women sit on top and the men sit on bottom. Why? Shelo yitarvu elu im elu, so they won't mix. So that's slightly different. It's slight, right? But we're saying we want them separately, not so they don't look at each other, but so they're not commingling. They're not socializing with each other in the same way. And the same thing is repeated in his rules for the temple in Hilchot Beit HaBechira, the 3rd Rambam that you see in source number 4. Ezrat Hanashim Haita Mukefet Gezutra. So this woman's gallery had a balcony surrounding it, so that when we have the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, so the first thing we say here, Kadesh Yihun Hashim Ra'ot Milamalan. We want the woman to be able to see what's going on downstairs. Fa'anashim milamatan, and the men would be downstairs. But again, he repeats the same reason that he had in the laws of shofar, sukkah, and lulav, Kadesh lo yu ma'arbivin, so they wouldn't be commingling. Okay, so the Rambam, again, we have twice he's saying the reason for the separate seating arrangement is so they don't commingle, and he also quotes the reason so they're not seeing each other.
We don't have to do a tag thing. I don't know exactly what we're supposed to do. Check the height. Okay. Well, and now a little sideways. We're good? Yeah, okay. Thank you, Rabbanit Atara, and that was a very quick move into the basic principles. We got it that in the temple the decision was made that men and women should be separated. It seemed that was always the case that men and women were separated for these festivities, or as they started seeing that troubles were coming, they tried a few different configurations and they settled on some type of balcony. So that's that's the premise for the discussion that you have about a Beit Knesset. Of course, a lot of what we saw could actually be impactful on every situation where men and women are together, and we're not here to make that case tonight. We're just going to stay with synagogue life. That sounds like a good thing, and no one wants to hear me say anything more but that anyway. Good. So here I mentioned to you that book, The Sanctity of the Synagogue, and he collects there, as I said, some of the big names of the 20th century. And here he happens to have quoted Rav Kook. Rav Soloveitchik said pretty much the same thing in a number of different ways. The same time, Rabbi Yosef Ber Soloveitchik, and that is, look, our synagogues are supposed to be as the Mikdash Ma'at, as a form of a miniature temple. Our synagogues are meant to recall and be modeled after the Beit HaMikdash, and in a lot of ways we did. We have a lot of our furnishings recall the different important vessels of the Beit HaMikdash, of the temple. And more generally, we want to say that our synagogues, when God destroyed the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, and we went off into exile, that where would God be found, and where we have that experience, we'd have it in the Beit HaKnesset that would be constructed throughout the exile. And so he lays out for us here that being the case, that we have to keep our synagogues following the practices of the Beit HaMikdash in critical ways, and this is one of them. Our holy forefathers set to the custom as a duty to be adherent to in the present day temples in miniature or houses of worship. Indeed, our fathers in establishing two separate divisions for men and women in the whole house of prayer, thereby continue the system in arguing the temple. And the next paragraph, it's absolutely unthinkable to introduce any changes in the sacred customs our fathers established, and how especially important is it to follow religiously our ancestral customs. And in the next paragraph, he makes the case that this is actually Torah law, that there be separation. There is an interesting debate as to whether or not having the barrier is a Torah law, or just being separate is a Torah law. And Rav Moshe Feinstein feels that having a real physical separation is a Torah obligation. Rav Soloveitchik says that's a rabbinic law, but just the separation is the Torah law. But that's where that's our shifting point to talking about a Beit HaKnesset needing to be similar to what happened to the Beit HaMikdash. And here we'll start to capture some of the key phrases that emerge. Maybe we'll start actually with the Chatam Sofer, and then I'll go back to the Gemara and Brachot first. So Chatam Sofer, a very powerful figure in Hungary, fighting the reformers in Hungary, and holding on to what our practices have been. He says very clearly, Hatam hazeh ki anu ma'aminim shekol tefillah u'shevach v'hoda'ah shemitarev v'machshava hahi shum hirhur afilu b'ishto lo taleb b'ma'alot lifnei Hashem yitbarach v'lo tekubal lefanav. You should know that any prayer that we're trying to offer that has happening at the same time, any type of sexual possible thought that might enter our minds, even with someone who's permitted to us, like our spouse. So you should know that that destroys that prayer. It's been corrupted by those thoughts. And he says, with anu mefreshim hanashim min hanashim b'beit haKnesset b'fnei atzman shelo yavo lidei hirhur b'shat tefillah. That the reason why men and women are separated is so that you should not come to any type of sexual thoughts, God forbid, during prayer. So the Chatam Sofer says the premise is hirhur aveira, at a time when it was meant to have a heightened spiritual mental focus, and the presumption is that being in the presence of women and being able to see women would be the problem. We understand the focal point is on men's prayer, and that's how often the conversation is happening from the men's perspective, and maybe we'll reflect on that a little bit later on. But that is the premise that you have, and you can find others who will agree with him. Will focus in on the choice of the Rambam in his commentary to say the reason why the women were put up in the balcony was kadesha lo yistaklu. So that men shouldn't be able to see them, and so the focus is there. The other rendering, though, is more what we saw in the Gemara itself, which was concerned about a certain degree of lightheartedness or levity. Levity that happens just when people are intermingling, and what's appropriate in certain contexts is not appropriate in other contexts, hypothetically. And here we'll go back on the top of the page to the Mishnah and Brachot. Einom din litpalel el mitoch koved rosh. A person should only pray from a mental space of gravity, koved rosh, where you have a heavy head, versus kalut rosh, which means lightheadedness or levity. That's what the bright that's quoted next. Einom din palel lo mitoch kalut rosh. If you see that's highlighted and boldened there. So we're really concerned that prayer not be happening in a way in which this levity is taking place. Oh, so we now know that, right, the Gemara talked about how you avoid levity, and that was to separate the men and the women. That was at least help bring that about. And so you have a very different model. One model has to do with gazing and the possibility of forbidden thoughts, and the other says it's not about that. It's about intermingling that brings about, it's a certain type of levity, and just not the spirit of the moment, without talking about anything sexual at all, just what happens when people are intermingling. So we all know that there are a lot of synagogues where people of only one sex is present, and there's a lot of levity that can happen there, if not talking about trades and sports or law or medicine or whatever else happens. So that's not in the spirit of it either. So Rav Moshe Feinstein was notably the one who took that position. And if you'll take a look at the bottom of the page, here, let's get right. I sort of hypothetically pointed out to us already. Here. Thus, what seems logical, in my humble opinion, is that it would suffice to have a mechitza that reaches to the shoulders, not to have a mechitza that is higher than that. For we have shown that the mechitza is not about a concern of gazing at the women, as I've written above, and that is a height of 3 amot, which is 18 tfachim, which he identifies elsewhere as 5 feet or 60 inches. That's Rav Moshe's general principle. Rav Moshe was a shortish man. I'll just point that out. And we can all do experiments to decide whether or not 60 inches would suffice to be a shoulder height, for other people. I don't know. And he presumed that people were shorter in his era. So, okay. And so that's important. I will note that Rav Moshe Feinstein, again, one of the greatest halachic decisors of the last century, did say that I'm not worried about the improper thoughts and how they impede on your prayer, but I am worried about the fact that if people are not dressed modestly, in this case, the women are not dressed modestly in shul, that would be a halachic concern for mechitza that allowed for visual possibilities. So he said, we presume that people are coming to shul dressed modestly. He focuses on head covering, and he focuses on sleeves on the arms as some examples of what we would hope would be the case in a synagogue situation where people could see one another. Okay. Turning the page, here we are on page 5, the Sridei Eish, who puts it out there. So Rav Moshe Feinstein, a great Gaon and expert in halachic rulings, has ruled that it's sufficient to have mechitza as 18 tefachim, 18 handbreadths, which is, as we said, around 60 inches, just below the shoulders, so the men and women should not come to talk to each other and thus come to a situation of levity. We're looking to help prevent interaction in shul, and that was enough to prevent interaction. Opposite him has come out the Satmar Rebbe. Satmar Rebbe was another force in this country, and he's representing the Hungarian approach that was there, Hungarian rabbis, and they have forbidden such a mechitza, and they have ruled that a mechitza needs to be higher than the tops of the heads. And they point to the other Rambam, as we said, Kadeshu is Taklu, and Moshe Feinstein appears more correct. And then he says the following: 3 days, it was important post-take after the war in Europe. So this last paragraph. Indeed, the Hungarian rabbis are very strict in this matter and demand that the mechitza be over the heads of the women. They go even further and demand that if the synagogue does not have such a mechitza, it's forbidden to pray there. It's forbidden for women to go to such a synagogue to pray, and it's better that they stay home. Certainly, he says, those Hungarian rabbis, is for the best to preserve standards of modesty they were practiced in early generations. However, in our time, the circumstances have changed, and if women were to stay at home and not come to the synagogue, they would completely forget their Judaism. So we can tell people to stay home. You can't. And it most certainly is forbidden to reject them and to distance them because of excessive stringencies that have no solid foundation in the Talmud and the decisors. There isn't really a basis for the over-the-head mechitza, he contends. And so he says, I'm fine with Rav Moshe Feinstein Mechitza. So those are two that you have. So we sort of put out there the over the head Mechitza, let's say it's 6 foot high. You have the shoulder height Mechitza, we'll call it 60 inches, 5 foot high. And then you have the third opinion, which says, look, in the end, what was sought was a physical separation with a divider that's there that defines separate spaces. In the end, that's what happened in the Beit HaMikdash. So it's defined separate spaces where you didn't cross over one another. And so you'll have an approach which says all you need is halachically is something the divider that creates separate space. That is not 18 tefachs, not 18 fist lengths. It's 10 tefachs, which is somewhere between 33 and 40 inches. And that creates a separation. If you've davened with us over the years on the high holidays, you'll know that this shul had a bunch of those metal posts and panels, which were basically 30 something inches high, and that would be doing that pretty much, right? But that's a third opinion, which says we are following what happened to Beit HaMikdash in the temple. We have a separation, and all you need is a halachic separation, and that's the basic non-mingling. Do we have to physically create a scenario where you can't mingle, or to say that you may not pass a box of tissues over, right? The Mechitza, and that will somehow break everything. And so that's the third opinion that says no. And here you have, this is Rabbi Yehuda Herzl Henkin, who passed away just 2 years ago, I think. A very, very special man. And he argued that in halachically, in principle, that's the case. He required you have a real physical structure, not just a curtain. And that's what he called for. So that's what those are our opinions. If you look on the back page, you have a little chart. My dear mentor, my friend and teacher also, Rabbi Linzer, helped prepare this chart. We did some fine tuning of some language. It kind of lays it out for you here, right? So if it's about being like the Beit HaMikdash, so seemingly 10 tefachs is sufficient. If it's about avoiding sexual thoughts, 6 feet is going to be required. And if it's about avoiding levity, then we have this other 60-inch kind of opportunity. That's kind of what we have there in those in the opinions that we know of. And you can follow down other conversations, including a last question which is, what about a woman who's in the back on the men's side, who might come into the shul? So we know, as we pointed out, in the temple, when women had a purpose to be in the men's area, or the Azat Yisrael, or even right to doing a sacrifice, they would go in. If you had a purpose to be there, you could be there. It didn't somehow rupture everything. And Rav Moshe Feinstein actually comments, and he said, look, it was the case in Europe, and it was a case that he knew that there were times when women would come into the back of the Beit Midrash where they didn't have a women's section at all, and they would stand in the back and daven. Sometimes they would come in collecting tzedakah. There were poor women who would come in to collect, and he said, it's okay. It's okay. If they're there regularly, you need to have a mechitza. But if it's occasional, then we daven. You didn't destroy. You didn't break a magical spell or a magical principle, barrier by them being there. It can happen that way. So we should have it in front of us. Let me just bring you to the last thing here for our purposes of learning, and you'll see. First, in the bottom right side, a quote from Rabbi Yosef Eliyahu Henkin. Rabbi Henkin, who was a great Rav in America and a great posek in America. He took the position that in a pressing situation, in Beshat HaDachak, you could have a 10 handbreadths mechitza with a curtain of some kind above it. I don't know what he meant by the curtain, but that's what he called for. And his grandson, who I referenced before, in effect takes that position. And here I have for you two quotations from Soloveitchik. There's one brief quotation about an oral tradition. And then if you can read this letter, it's written to Rabbi Sable. Rabbi Sable, who was often a guest in our shul, he was good friends with Rabbi Grauer of blessed memory, and also Rabbi Sable of blessed memory, was the rabbi of the RJC, the Real Jewish Center, and they were building the synagogue. And he had a meeting with Rabbi Soloveitchik. So it's just sweet to read the whole letter. Dear Rabbi Sable, please excuse the delay in answering your letter. Firstly, very nice handwriting. I enjoyed the visit at the home of Mr. Schoen, whom I hold in high regard, and I wish to thank you, and through you, the host, Mr. Schoen, for the cordial reception tendered to me. Isn't that nice how people write letters? And the Rav wrote a letter. With reference to your inquiry about the height of the Mechitza in your synagogue, let me say that if the Mechitza will be 50 inches high, from the level of the floor in the women's section, I would consider it satisfactory. So a 15-inch Mechitza is what he called for and what he required. I know that his brother, Rabbi Soloveitchik, took the same position, that a 15-inch Mechitza was completely sufficient for a synagogue to have. So the world that inherited Moshe's traditions, worked with that presumption, and the students of Rav Soloveitchik are aware of Rav Soloveitchik's position, and we'll talk about that maybe at the end, in the latter part of our conversation. So, are there any quick questions you have about a lot of material that we threw at you? Go ahead, Lara. Yeah. Good. So Lara asked the question, how do you deal with the two different languages in the Rambam? And you have two choices. One is to say the Rambam, we definitely take the Mishnah Torah as the more important quotation of the Rambam. That's where he makes halachic statements. And so as commenting the Mishnah, some people say he just changed his mind, or he just wasn't thinking about the implications of it. And others say, well, it was really about ultimately still to worry about leading to levity, and it wasn't about really forbidding the act of gazing. It wasn't about immodest thoughts. It was still about somehow coming to have levity. So they worked their way through it. And others say, you know what, the Rambam said what he said in the commentary on the Mishnah, but we just look at what he said in the halachic work of the Mishnah Torah. And so that's how you have not mingling as a key principle that we have. Any other quick questions about the material part? Yeah.
What Rabbi say about levity or lack of focus on prayer within the sexes? Like,
Yeah.
As much conversation about it, or is it just assumed that it's about being around the opposite sex?
So I referenced briefly about what happens sometimes, and you asked the question, how do we apply? We're repeating for the recording. Yeah. So I can't tell you where my head is in knowing all the information when they talk about. Certainly there was conversation about having the right focus when you pray. So that is there. Whether or not when people are together, they avoid, being, levitas. I don't know. It's a problem. But like I try to encourage us, if you have idle conversation to have, please take it outside, because it's not appropriate for the synagogue, right? Yeah.
About the concern.
Yeah.
That's the primary source of levity. And that's just not my witness experience, I guess, like having dominant shuls that are mixed and
Correct. Yeah. So you're saying your lived experience is that mixed views don't lead to people having a party and all that stuff. Yes, I understand that. And the truth is, again, we borrowed from a case of a festive situation, and now we're putting it into the heady space where we maybe think that it might not necessarily have the same worry for us. So I'm aware of that, but in the end, they borrow. We take what the rules were, and we take the concern, and we fit it into boxes for our synagogues, and it's hard sometimes to see how it all lines up exactly. One last question. Yeah. So you asked whether or not the implications in Beit HaMikdash was mixed. So firstly, it wasn't a time of prayer. That was a space where people were just gathering to take care of whatever they had to take care of in the temple. And then when they have a gathering time, they decided we should separate. But the Gemara ultimately quotes the verses in Zechariah, right? So the verses in Zechariah, interestingly, are referred to as Devar Torah by some, instead of being Divrei Sofrim or something, Divrei Nevi'im, the prophetic words instead of Torah words, but they are giving them more, at least biblical source, as the Gemara seems to give the weight that way. So there you have it. Let's shift a little bit. So we're going to just reflect a little bit about the lived experience, and then we'll talk a little bit about the sanctuary that we had.
I want to add just one. I want to highlight something in the chart that, as a woman, because I am going to speak a little bit as a woman, that I think has been very helpful to know, is that the rules of Mechitza, we have two elements here. We have sitting separately, and we have an actual Mechitza, an actual partition. And we always believe that we should be separate during tefillah, during prayer, but the Mechitza, according to two of the premises that are put in the chart, right? When is a Mechitza needed? According to, unless you think it's about just gazing at each other, but if it's just about sitting separately, then if you're in a space which is not an official Beit HaKnesset, meaning in a Shiva house or in an office building, right? A lot of times there's an assumption that there needs to be a partition, and they'll make a woman often, because usually there are more men than women, sit outside. And it's important to know that you can say, actually, I can be inside. I just need to be behind you or to the side of you. So that's just an important piece of information for men and women to know. But I find that as a woman, sometimes we can get pushed aside or in spaces where we don't need to be. So just pay attention to that, is that it's not necessarily you need a mechitza unless you're in an actual Beit HaKnesset, a shul. That's one thing. And I guess I just wanted to reflect a little bit about the lived experience of a mechitza. When, in Israel, they used to take us to a lot of beautiful shuls, a lot of beautiful, batei knasiot, and we would see these beautiful things. And I, as a little, teenager, would be like, I just want to go upstairs to the women's section and see what it looks like from up there, because I don't think it's going to look the same. And it's true, it doesn't look the same when you're upstairs. And that was a little bit cynical of me, and true, I think. And on the other hand, I also want to reflect upon the fact that it doesn't necessarily impact the experience of prayer in the way that we might say it does, right? So yes, we don't, if I just want to say, there's the priority of having men and women sit like we do in this shul. But I also want to talk about these shuls, which are very prevalent, the Hungarian type shuls that have women sitting upstairs, which I think a lot of us have davened in as men or as women. And I actually had a wonderful experience of growing up in a shtibel, right? So the Rabbi actually lived in the real shtibel, Hungarian shtibel, where the Rabbi lived there and the Rabbi, his Rebbitzin, and we davened upstairs in the balcony. And that is some of my favorite experiences of shul are in that shul, in that shtibel, where the women's gallery was upstairs. There was very little visibility, but the women were very much a tzibur community unto themselves. There was the Alter Rebbitzin and there was the younger Rebbitzin, and they greeted everybody that came in. And we had our own kalut rosh, levity that happened there. But I think it was maybe an appropriate type of kalut rosh for tefillah, very much one of caring, and also one very much of the Rebbe knew where we were. He would when they did the auction in Yiddish, he would call up and you could yell down how much you wanted to pay. And if you had a chola, you can yell down. And I'm just saying, and I don't think this shul is a very unique shul. It's still around today. I could give you the address if you want to go. My grandfather was the Baal Tefillah. And so when he died, the Rebbe who took over for him used to forget the songs, to forget the tunes. So he would send my father up to my mother and me, who would go and sing it to my father, who would go down and sing it to him. And that would happen throughout the whole entire Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah services. And so I guess I want to say that it did feel, and I've heard from other women in some of these prayer spaces where the women are very much separate, they feel like sometimes it's a nicer tefillah, that they can have their own privacy. They feel like it's almost more empowering and more conducive to a serious type of tefillah. And I want to give respect to that, and also say that there also is there's a loss in having that, also of not having women see the beautiful tefillah and the other things that go on there. So I just wanted to, and I guess we'll invite other reflection also but not now.
Yeah.
For now, or...
Let's shift to this part and then we'll. Work. Good. Let's talk a little bit about our shul. And I'm looking around the room and nobody was here in those early years. But our shul, which was originally a breakaway from the conservative synagogue from Temple Israel in 1915, as we pointed out, I think at other points, that when the organ was brought into Temple Israel over on Fisher Avenue, that was like a breaking point for some of the congregants who said, the organ can't be here because of the organ, and as you know, there is no organ now at Temple Israel. And they started their own services, and we should just know that at least I don't know exactly what the structure was when they built the building on South Lexington. I can ask the minister there if she has any pictures. She came looking for drawing. She came one time looking for drawings and architectural drawings of the synagogue, which is now the church there. But I do know that when this building was built, the building did not have a mechitza. The sanctuary did not have a mechitza. In the 1950s, this was a separate seating, but not mechitza congregation. And that's how it began here, at least. And then over time, so we talk about the fact that many synagogues were, heading in one direction and pulling things out. And in this congregation, as with many other congregations, there were progress that was made often by the rabbis who came to try to bring people back to traditional ways. And so at one point the Mechitza was put into the congregation. As you now familiar, now those of you who were here, right, you know that we had the men were in the center and the women were on the two perimeter sections, and that too had alterations. There was a tikkun gadol, there was some major repair that happened. At one point, it was just the women's section, which probably came up to here. I'm going to guess on if the woman was standing on her side, right up to that part of her. And then they put a number of those bars that were there that were really injurious to your vision of seeing, but that was an attempt to try to up the situation here, right? It was an attempt to meet a different standard. So it wasn't a standard that would really meet most of the opinions that we said. The 10 tafach opinion it would meet, but Rav Moshe no, and Rav Soloveitchik no, certainly not on the men's side. It might have been 50 inches, but not from the women's side. And so just aware of that, and we davened here, and that was who we were. But when it came time for us to do our work now, we had an opportunity to really conceive of what we wanted to achieve. And part of that was then to try to meet Rav Soloveitchik's expectation of a 15th Mechitza. As I mentioned in Providence, where I was the rabbi, actually Rabbi Rubenstein of blessed memory, the rabbi of Young Israel Scarsdale, was a predecessor of mine. In Providence, there was one rabbi between us, and he helped put a mechitza in that shul, which had been a conservative synagogue. And he had discussed it with Rabbi Aaron Soloveitchik, Rav Yosef Beer's brother, he was a student of his. And they developed a 50-inch mechitza, which was made out of lattice work. It wasn't very pretty, but it was there. And what happened was that some of the folks in town didn't believe that couldn't be. Because it was a yeshiva element, there was a kollel in town, very fine people, I have a very nice relationship with them. And when at least I hear that they said, "Nah, I don't believe it," and so he said, "No, Rabbi Aaron told me this." And so Rabbi Aaron came as a guest to I think one midweek, and they had a minyan there, and there were people who were like honing in to see whether he was actually saying the words of the davening, or he just like said, "It's good enough for you, but not good enough for me." And apparently he really davened, so that's a good thing. But in Providence, when I was there, one of the conversations that we had were people saying, well, we have an element in the community, again, from the kollel, who don't feel comfortable davening here. Some did, some didn't. Why don't we just make it a Rav Moshe Mechitza, so that they would be happy davening here? And it was a really important conversation that we had. That for the people that are members of the congregation, this is the type of Mechitza that they want. And it has to be something that's going to enable their prayer to work for them. And that's where the other values, as long as it meets the halachic standard, that a reputable halachic standard, that we take that if it meets that, then you have to honor that and not always look to be machmir. And as I said, I want to be machmir. The people should keep Shabbos more carefully. I don't have to be more machmir to meet the other criteria for mechitza if this one is the rock solid criteria for us to have. So just like the two sides of improving, but improving comes with a sense, it has to come up against what are the other things that you're cherishing and you're attempting to accomplish. So let's talk about our mechitza. Anybody who's on the video, right? There's our mechitza. Moving, that's not going to make a difference, right? Oh, I see, right. Anybody? So I'm talking to the people in the room, and afterwards, anybody who's watching the video, come and spend Shabbos with us. You'll see. So our mechitza here, which is, as you can tell, I don't have a measuring tool with me right now. This is a 50-inch high mechitza, which is 40 inches opaque and 10 inches clear on the top. That is, in effect, in many ways, for what. Come back to the microphone. What Rav Henkin had commented, at least in the minimal size, will be 40 inches that way, plus the glass on top accomplishes it. And that was a decision that we wanted to make for us, where the value that we feel here, and I think we're conveying, is that it's not a men's space that women are able to watch. maybe jugglers in the temple times, that that's what was happening. And certainly, obviously, when the davening is happening through the men who are leading the davening and the Torah reading, then we understand that. But to define the space as not being the men's space where the women are observers, but it's a shared space of the men and the women together. And that's how we put our minds to thinking about what this would be. Even the choice of the opaque panels, enabling you to be aware that somebody's on the other side. You can't see them, right? It's a solid thing, but we wanted you to daven, even if you're seated. I guess no one's that short, you won't notice that someone over the top, but you just be aware there's another person from, a man or a woman on the other side who's a davener here, and we're all davening here together. And so it's about shifting from observer message to that everyone's a participant, to enable everyone to have a sense of equal connection to the experience of davening. And as we made decisions to the Aron, there's the Mechitza in front here, and the choice to have this being the center, this equidistant, we're all part of that. And I think we've done a pretty good job trying to achieve that. And the sense, firstly, Mechitza or not, the whole room being one where you all feel that you are at a place. It's a little problem for people who want to hide in davening, people who want to just be a little alone, because we've not made a great corner for hiding. That's okay. I'm sorry, but that's how we set up. But the goal was everyone should be able to feel that they are close and connected to what's happening here, and we're doing it together. So that's how we made our decisions. And it was a wonderful committee, a sanctuary committee. Leah was one of the members of that committee. As anybody else on the committee who was here? I don't know. To really, really, really give a lot of thought to all the elements of this. And in the end, we gravitated towards the Rav Soloveitchik's Mechitza, not because we were looking for a way out, but trying to create the way in for all of our members together. And that's what we have. So, I'm sorry we rushed because there was a lot of material to do, but I hope this was an educational experience for you, and I invite any questions you might have about what we learned tonight. David.
Can you talk a little about the things on the sides?
Things on the sides.
Which
Yeah.
Which seem to not satisfy.
Right.
Any of the things
So David asked about these two sections over here. So they are 40-inch. High, and that meets the other standard. There was a sense that we might not even require them at all because of the distance between the two sides of the room, but I felt it was important for us to have a Mechitza set there anyway, even though it wasn't going to be that high. If someone's sitting right here, and to have the full-on Mechitza, I think would be visually very difficult to feel connected. So we came up with this middle size.
Was that to prevent commingling or to prevent people from seeing across?
It's meant to fulfill the requirements of having separation in the synagogue, with perhaps not connected to a specific goal per se, which is sort of that third opinion, which says the synagogue's temple had physical separation, so we have to create the physical structures of separation too, and so that's how we came to do that. Who else we got it right? Go ahead. Yeah, right. So we're going to have more conversation about that. I really want to use the evening for that, but I wanted us to understand, in order to have that conversation and to understand how you make, yes, right, the question about whether we have a number of seats for people who might be gender non-conforming, which is the challenge that some individuals have in coming into Orthodox synagogue. So that is something that first, we want to make sure we understand how Mechitza works. So the premises are, it's not voodoo, it's about rules and structures. And then how a synagogue that has the structures very clearly in place can make a carve out and meet certain requirements for how you make that carve out in a small way is what we want to explore to do. But we're not going to use it this evening to talk about that, but I thought it was really, we couldn't have that conversation without really understanding Mechitza. So, I'm appreciative that we were able to do this really irrespective of that conversation, but I think helping, lay some groundwork for folks. What else we got? Well, yeah, go ahead.
I understand that you said like the
the yeshiva people that run the finance station, not accepted by like the norm of the yeshiva world, the yeshiva world of the British position. But I think yeshiva is pulled up in basically like when they're fully separate, that the future goes all the way up to the ceiling.
Yeah.
So
How does it work? You're asking that when these very different opinions, and that I won't have it in your shul, you won't have it in my shul, and say that shouldn't be new to you. That's how our world sometimes works, which is that is the reality that's there. And I do wonder whether or not folks who would even be of the Hungarian ilk would in the end say that Rav Moshe Feinstein, I'll daven there, right? Even though I wouldn't have chosen that, even though Satmar Rav did not, was dead set against it. But that would be the case. I don't know whether, and I don't know whether some folks would, wrap their heads around Rav Soloveitchik's position, even though it wasn't the one they would have chosen. I think we've seen people who choose to daven with us, even though it might not be their choice. I'll tell you a sweet story. We do have sometimes visitors from Hasidic visitors who are here to take advantage of some of the medical units that are here in the area, and they'll come for Shabbos, and it's always enlightening for them. And some of them think it's great, some of them just don't know what to do. So I remember in our old sanctuary, a gentleman came in and Friday night, and so he saw what we had, and then he saw we had the accordion doors in the back. So he says, "The Weiber sit back here." Right, the women sitting behind the accordion doors. I said, no, they're sitting over there. And he said, okay. And he dealt with it, right? So it was, for some people, it's really foreign to come into a shul like ours. And hopefully when they do, they'll feel, especially if they have an understanding that it's not about just breaking down things, but trying to affirm things and being grounded halachically, that hopefully people can appreciate what we're doing. Okay, your last question, Leah.
I apologize, something you kind of covered before, but I was wondering how we, I know you talked about like balance between our values as a community and Halachic values. I was wondering how we kind of landed on the position of Rav Soloveitchik. Is there like just a Halachic reason why we would kind of go with his position as opposed to many of the other positions? Like why specifically?
Yeah. She asked why would we tend towards Rav Soloveitchik, not the other ones, and so partially it is that I think that we know our communities, or many rabbis knew their communities, and they knew in their communities that having a higher Mechitza was a difficult challenge for many of the congregants to be able to live with. Interesting, where Moshe Feinstein sometimes talks about Rabbi, if your Balabatim, your members are beating you and pushing you, okay, you can do this, and if they're really pushing you that, and this you got to stop at. So there was that sense, but it's also just saying, I know my people, I know what works for them and what can't work for them, and so you gravitate towards an opinion that you feel it can reasonably understand them, and the Rav understood all of his students, I being one of them, well, largely, having been so only for a year in his class, but the hundreds of students that he had were heirs to his teaching. And so that became, in the modern Orthodox world, an appreciation. And that doesn't say that in many modern Orthodox synagogues not also having Rav Moshe Mechitza, but if you're a student of the Rav, then that's something you can feel you can happily and respectfully adopt. Folks, it's 9:10. We're going to end the evening. Thank you for learning Torah with Rabbanit, Atara, and with me. I hope that it was informative. And if you have more questions, feel free, please, to reach out. Awesome.